She walked into my new house like she already owned it. Her parents followed, scanning every corner. The marble countertop, the garden view, the soundproof study I'd built with my own hands. "It feels so big," her mother said. "We'll fit just fine." I stood there silent, my hand still holding the keys. They didn't know it yet, but this house wasn't just a home, and it was my line in the sand. I had spent 30 years building everything from scratch, and I wasn't about to let anyone rewrite my name on the deed. So when my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "We've been thinking, my parents could stay here permanently," I nodded slowly. I'd already prepared a lesson, one she would never forget. 2 weeks before that conversation, the house was still a blueprint, a clean architectural draft that I reviewed every night after work. 3 bedrooms, a private office, a guest suite facing the lake, and a workshop beneath the deck. I'd retired from the construction firm 6 months earlier, using part of my severance and savings to fund the project. My plan was simple: a quiet place where my wife and I could finally breathe after 40 years of work. But then she passed away unexpectedly, 2 months before the house was finished. Her absence changed everything. The house became both a monument and a boundary, the one thing I could still control. When my son Mark and his wife Emma started visiting during the final stages of construction, I thought they were just checking in. Mark was polite, distracted, always on his phone. Emma, on the other hand, asked too many questions about the deed, the square footage, the resale value. At first I brushed it off as curiosity. Then one evening, while the workers were still finishing the railing on the deck, I overheard her telling her parents on the phone, "It's almost done. You'll love the kitchen. It's better than ours." Ours, that word hit me like a hammer. She hadn't even lived here a day, and already she was claiming it as hers. Her parents had been renting for years, always between places. I helped them once during Mark's wedding, paying for a hotel when their old landlord kicked them out. I didn't realize then that it would become a pattern. They never stayed in one place long enough to pay the last month's rent. Always someone else's couch, someone else's spare room. Emma had inherited that mindset. Comfort through other people's effort. A week before move-in, Mark called me. "Dad," he said, "Emma was wondering if her parents could help us settle in for a while." "Just until they find something," I asked. "How long is a while?" He hesitated. "Maybe a few months." I told him no. Not because I was cruel, but because I knew a few months in their language meant until you stop asking. He sighed, said he understood, but I could already hear Emma in the background, whispering. 3 days later, a moving truck I didn't recognize was parked in front of my driveway. I stood on the porch and watched as Emma directed the drivers. Her parents' sofa, boxes labeled kitchen, even their old TV stand. "We're just leaving this here temporarily," she said with that practiced smile. "Mark said it's fine." I called Mark. He didn't pick up. That was the moment I stopped being polite. I walked back inside, closed my office door, and opened my email. I had the deed scanned as a PDF, along with the title insurance and the notarized clause I'd added 3 months earlier. One line that gave me full exclusive ownership rights. No co-signers, no shared liabilities. That night I drafted an email to my attorney. Subject line: occupancy clarification. I explained the situation and attached photos of the boxes and the truck. The next morning he called me back, laughing quietly. "They're trying to squat in a new build? That's bold." He advised me to install a security system immediately and document everything, so I did. Cameras by the front and back doors, motion sensors inside the guest suite, and a hidden camera in the garage facing the storage area. Then I waited. 2 days later, Emma came over again, this time with her parents in tow. "We'll only stay a week," her father said, already carrying a suitcase. "Emma said you were fine with it." I smiled, opened the door wide, and said, "Of course, make yourselves comfortable." Because sometimes the best lesson begins by letting the other side feel safe. That night they made dinner in my kitchen without asking. Oil splattered on the backsplash, wine glasses left on the counter. I ate alone in my office, listening through the camera feed. Emma laughed with her mother, saying, "He's just lonely once we're here more often. He'll get used to it." I leaned back in my chair, turned off the monitor, and whispered to myself, "No, I won't." By the end of the week, I had every timestamp I needed, every entry, every light left on, every word caught on audio. The last recording was the one that sealed it. Emma's father said, "Once he signs the transfer, this place will finally feel like ours." Emma replied, Don't worry. I'll handle the paperwork. That was the moment I decided the lesson would be written in ink, not words. The following morning, I called Mark early. My tone was calm, the kind of calm that usually makes people nervous. Your in-laws seem comfortable, I said. He exhaled heavily. Dad, Emma didn't mean to overstep. It's just, her parents are in a tough spot. They've been in a tough spot since the 90s, I replied, and it's always someone else's couch. There was a long silence. Please, just let them stay a few more weeks. Emma's been stressed, you know how she gets. I know exactly how she gets, I said and hung up. I spent that afternoon cleaning the workshop, pretending not to hear the footsteps upstairs. Her father liked to hum when he shaved. Her mother liked to rearrange my cabinets. I kept notes of everything. Dates, times, what they moved, what they used. The house was wired for Wi-Fi, but they hadn't realized every device had a unique IP tag. By day 3, I had every MAC address and knew which phone belonged to whom. It wasn't paranoia. It was documentation. Emma began stopping by daily, acting like a hostess in a house she didn't own. We're planning to redo the curtains, she said one afternoon. It'll brighten the space, I asked. Who's we? She blinked. Me and Mom, of course, I smiled. Then maybe you should bring fabric samples to your own place. She frowned, muttered something about me being territorial, and walked off to the kitchen. That evening I checked the footage again. Her parents were sitting in my living room discussing which room they'd turn into a guest area. Her mother said, "He'll come around. Old men always soften." Her father laughed and replied, "Once the paperwork's shared, he won't have a choice." That single word, paperwork, kept echoing in my mind. The next day, a thick envelope arrived by courier, addressed to me but written in Emma's handwriting. Inside were printouts, a draft transfer of partial ownership form, unsigned but with my name typed next to hers and Mark's. No lawyer header, just a lazy copy of a template she'd pulled off the internet. I sat down at my desk, took a photo of every page, and sent them to my attorney, caption, "And now the lesson begins." He called within minutes. "Don't confront them directly. Just follow my instructions. I'll draft a counter document." 2 days later, I invited them all for dinner. Mark, Emma, and her parents. I grilled steaks, opened a bottle of wine, set the table perfectly. They came dressed like it was a celebration. Emma's mother even brought flowers. I thanked her, placed them in a vase, and positioned the vase right in front of the hidden camera. "To family," Emma's father said, raising his glass. I nodded, watching his reflection in the window. After dessert, I brought out a manila folder. "I wanted to clear some things before we move forward," I said casually. Emma perked up. "Oh? That's great, Dad. I actually printed something too." I interrupted. "I've already seen it." The silence that followed was dense. Mark looked confused. "Seen what?" "The transfer form," I said, placing her draft on the table. Her parents froze. Emma's voice dropped. "You went through my things." "No," I said evenly. "You sent it to me." Then I slid another folder forward. My attorney's document notarized that morning. "This is a lease agreement," I said. "Short-term 7 days. Rent set at market rate, $4,200 for the week. Payable in advance, non-refundable. After that, you vacate." Emma's father sputtered. "You can't charge family rent." I smiled slightly. "This isn't family housing. This is a residence under my sole name. You can read the clause." Emma's cheeks flushed red. "You're humiliating us." I leaned back. "No, you're trespassing. This is me handling it legally." Mark tried to speak, but I raised my hand. "I warned you." More than once. Her father pushed back his chair and muttered something about lawyers and respect. I handed him a second sheet. "Already contacted mine." They left that night without finishing their drinks. I expected some backlash, maybe angry calls or guilt messages. But the next morning, the driveway was empty. The cameras showed them hauling boxes into a borrowed van around midnight. I thought that would be the end of it. But 3 days later, I got a visit from a building inspector. Someone had filed a complaint. Unsafe modifications, possible code violation. I almost laughed. They'd tried to weaponize bureaucracy. The inspector checked everything, found nothing wrong, and even complimented the wiring. I asked if I could see the complaint. He showed me, filed under Emma's father's name, using my address as shared occupancy. That was his mistake. I forwarded the report to my lawyer. who drafted a cease and desist order for misuse of residential address. Legally, it barred them from using my property for any registration, mail, or claim. Then he suggested something clever. Let's make the lesson public. He meant a filing in county records visible online, confirming my exclusive ownership and listing unauthorized occupants by name. Once it's filed, anyone running a background check sees it. It's not vindictive, and it's procedural transparency. So we did. A week later, Mark called again. Dad, what did you do? Emma's parents said you blacklisted them. I said I didn't blacklist anyone. I just filed truth. He was silent for a while, then said softly, Emma's furious. I replied, good. Maybe she'll learn what boundaries look like, but she didn't. The next morning, I received an email from her titled, Since You Love Paperwork. Inside was a scanned letter accusing me of emotional distress and discrimination. I read it twice and smiled. Attached below was a request for shared property mediation. What she didn't realize was that mediation requires both parties to have standing, and she had none. My attorney replied formally, citing the deed number and section, stating, the claimant has no legal relationship to the property or its owner. That same night, I poured myself a whiskey, sat on the porch, and watched the sunset reflect off the lake. I realized the house finally felt peaceful again. But peace doesn't come free. It's built, like foundations, layer by layer after storms of entitlement have passed. The lesson wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about ownership, of space, of effort, of dignity. 3 quiet weeks passed, the kind of quiet that makes you almost suspicious. The cameras picked up nothing but delivery trucks and the sound of wind moving through the trees. I started waking up earlier again, cooking my own breakfast, repairing small things that didn't need repair. A shelf here, a window latch there. It wasn't about maintenance anymore. It was about reclaiming rhythm. The house finally sounded like a home. Floorboards settling, the distant creak of the dock, birds starting up before dawn. Then one morning, a new sound, an envelope sliding through the mail slot. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. Inside, a formal letter from a local law firm representing Mr. and Mrs. Henson, Emma's parents. It stated that my house had become their temporary residence, of record during a period of familial transition, and requested that I honor the implied tenancy established by presence and contribution. I had to read it twice. Implied tenancy. In plain English, that meant they were claiming squatters' rights. They had spent less than 2 weeks here, but they were trying to build a legal fiction. I smiled. They had walked straight into my trap. My lawyer James met me that afternoon. He arrived in his old Lexus carrying his usual leather briefcase and that quiet look that always meant he was 5 steps ahead. They're bluffing, he said before even sitting down. But we're going to make it official anyway. He handed me a folder titled, Notice of Unauthorized Tenancy Termination. It wasn't just a cease and desist. It was a recorded document we'd file at the county clerk's office, time-stamped, notarized, and accessible to any public inquiry. This does 2 things, he explained. It blocks them from filing any future claim, and it establishes you as having acted in good faith under landlord-tenant law. If they escalate, they lose automatically. I nodded. Let's do it, he smiled. Already scheduled for tomorrow morning. That night, I opened my laptop and checked the camera archives again. I watched old clips of them wandering through the living room, moving my things. I paused at one frame. Emma's mother sitting at the dining table sipping wine saying, "This place feels like it was meant for us." It wasn't anger that hit me this time. It was clarity. People like that don't steal because they need. They steal because they think everyone else will forgive them. The next morning, James and I drove to the clerk's office downtown. The filing took 15 minutes. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with glasses on a chain, stamped the documents and said, "Once this is entered, they can't even use your address for mail forwarding." James nodded. Exactly what we want. By the time we walked out, the record was live. It was done in ink and law, not emotion. 2 days later, Emma showed up. She didn't call, didn't text, just pulled into the driveway in her SUV, the engine still running. I stepped out to meet her. She was shaking, holding her phone. "You humiliated my parents," she said. "You ruined their credit, their reputation." I looked at her evenly. No, they did that to themselves. I just documented it. Mark is furious, she said. He says you've gone too far. Then he's welcome to go with them, I said quietly. She blinked, stunned. You'd choose paperwork over family? I took a step closer. I'd choose integrity over parasites. For a second, I thought she might slap me, but she didn't. She just turned, slammed the car door, and drove off. That evening, Mark called. His tone was different now, colder, older. Dad, he said, Emma and I are staying with her parents for now. She says she can't be around you. That's fine, I said. Maybe distance will help her understand what boundaries mean. You're impossible, he muttered and hung up. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty dock. My son was gone, maybe temporarily, maybe for good. I'd known it might come to this. You can't fight entitlement without losing something along the way. 2 weeks later, a manila envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside was a copy of the termination notice, stamped, processed, and archived, along with a letter from the clerk. Record filed permanently. Calicermer Q47619B. I placed it in my safe, next to my wife's wedding ring and the deed. 3 symbols of permanence, love, law, and land. But Emma wasn't done. I didn't know it yet, but she'd started a whisper campaign online. Posts on local forums. Beware of this man. Heartless father evicts elderly couple. Abuse of family trust. None of them used my full name, but the details were close enough for neighbors to guess. I first heard about it when Mrs. Lewis from down the road called me. Is it true you kicked out your daughter-in-law's parents? She asked gently. I read something online. I took a deep breath. Yes, I said. And I'd do it again. She paused, then said quietly, Good. Someone needed to. It turned out Mrs. Lewis's cousin had rented to the Hensons years ago. Same story. Unpaid rent, broken furniture, endless excuses. That phone call gave me an idea. I went through the county's public records and found 5 prior evictions tied to their name, across 3 states. 5. I printed each one, highlighted the dates, and handed them to James the next day. Think this might come in handy? He smiled. You read my mind. The next morning, he sent a single email to Emma's parents' attorney, attaching those records and CCing Emma. The subject line read, Pattern of occupancy behavior, reference only. Within 24 hours, the posts disappeared. Every last one. No apology, no confrontation, just silence. And that silence was louder than any victory speech. Around that same time, Mark finally reached out again, this time from a new number. His text was short. We're moving out of state. Needed space. Take care. I stared at it for a while before replying, Take care of yourself, son. He didn't answer. For a few months, I lived as though they'd all been a bad dream. The house became peaceful again. I started volunteering at the local workshop, teaching basic carpentry to teenagers who wanted to learn something real. There's something cleansing about showing someone how to build instead of how to take. One of the students asked me once, Why do you always measure twice before cutting? I smiled. Because once it's gone, you can't get it back. Then one afternoon, a real estate agent knocked on my door. Mr. Hale? She asked. I have a listing inquiry here. Your property? I frowned. My property isn't listed. She turned the tablet toward me. There it was, a fake listing on a rental site using my photos, my address, and Emma's phone number. Rent set at $4,500 per month. We flagged it as suspicious, she said. But someone's clearly using your details. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just annoyance, it was criminal. I called James immediately. Within 2 hours, he'd traced the ad to a burner email linked to a social media account under Emma's name. He drafted a formal cease and desist with a threat of digital fraud prosecution under state law. This one's serious, he said. We'll file if she doesn't remove it within 48 hours. She didn't. So we did. The county sheriff's office handled it discreetly, but I know she got the letter. The fake listing vanished the same day. I heard later, through a mutual friend, Vio, that Emma broke down when the sheriff showed up at their rental. Mark tried to mediate again, but the damage was done. The firm she worked for dropped her quietly a week later. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just sat on the back deck that evening, watching the last light fade over the water. I poured a drink, looked at the reflection of the house, and said aloud, Lesson delivered. A month passed and the quiet began to feel permanent. I would wake before dawn, make coffee, and sit on the porch watching the fog roll off the lake, wondering if peace could really last. It was strange, how silence could feel both comforting and fragile, like glass that might crack if you breathed too loud. I had started sketching again, old habit from when I was young, drafting beams and walls with a pencil instead of CAD. The house, now complete and untouched, looked like it belonged to someone disciplined. Everything was in its place, but I knew better. Behind every surface there was a lesson paid for in patience. One Thursday morning, as I was marking measurements for a small dock extension, the phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. "Mr. Hale?" a male voice asked. "This is Detective Rollins with the County Sheriff's Department. Could you come down to the station? We need to clear up a complaint." My first thought was simple. They're at it again. At the station, Rollins offered coffee and handed me a printout. "They've filed a report accusing you of theft and unlawful possession of family property. Said you took assets meant for your son." I laughed once. "My son never owned a thing I didn't buy." Rollins nodded. "We know, but it's protocol. Mind if I record your statement?" I gave it. Calmly, clearly, with documents in hand. The deed, the receipts, the bank transfers from my personal account, each dated months before the house was even built. Rollins tapped the table. "You're thorough." "Years of construction management," I said. "We live and die by documentation." He smiled faintly. "They have no case. I just needed your signature so I can close it officially." 10 minutes later, I was free to go. Outside the station, I sat in my truck for a long time before starting the engine. They'd gone from squatting to social sabotage to false reports. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about control. They couldn't stand the idea that I'd drawn a boundary they couldn't cross. I called James that afternoon. "They tried the police route," I said. "Expected," he replied. "They're running out of rope. Let's tighten it." He proposed something new. A civil declaration of harassment, a tool most people didn't even know existed. It wasn't an arrest, but it created a public record documenting repeated false claims and intimidation attempts. "Once it's approved," James said, "any future complaint they file is automatically flagged. Judges hate patterns. It took 3 weeks. During that time, I focused on rebuilding my routine. Groceries on Tuesdays, fishing on Fridays, volunteering at the workshop twice a week. The kids there had started calling me Mr. Measure Twice, a nickname that made me smile every time. I had learned to laugh again, even if quietly, but peace never stays unchallenged. One afternoon, I found a note pinned under my windshield wiper. "Family doesn't take you to court. Shame on you." No signature, but the handwriting was Emma's. The cameras caught her car leaving the driveway at 7:13 a.m. I didn't even bother confronting her. Instead, I forwarded the footage to James. "Perfect," he wrote back. "That's Exhibit A. The harassment declaration was approved within a week." The document was short, only 3 pages, but its effect was sharp as a blade. It legally recognized me as the harassed party and prohibited the Hensons and Emma from approaching, contacting, or misrepresenting me publicly. Any violation could lead to fines or a misdemeanor charge. It wasn't revenge. It was law protecting peace. That weekend, I received an email from Mark. Subject line: "I don't recognize you anymore." It began politely, then devolved into guilt and half-truths. "Mom would have wanted us to stay close. You've turned cold, Dad. You pushed everyone away." I read it twice before responding. "Your mother believed in fairness. You mistake firmness for coldness. You married into noise, not family." I never got a reply. Weeks blurred into months. The lake froze over in December, smooth and silent. I spent evenings by the fireplace reading case law and sketching. Sometimes I'd print old photos, my wife smiling at the half-built deck, Mark holding a box on moving day before everything turned complicated. I kept those photos on the mantle not for nostalgia, but as evidence of how fast comfort turns to corrosion when boundaries disappear. Then, just as winter was ending, James called. "You're going to like this," he said. "The Hensons just filed for bankruptcy. And guess whose name they tried to use as a co-signer reference?" I didn't answer. He laughed. "Yours again." But because of the harassment record, the court flagged it as fraudulent entry. "They're officially blacklisted from credit applications for 2 years." He paused. Want to push it further? No, I said. The lesson's already written. Good, he replied. Then let them read it every time they get a rejection letter. That night I opened the back doors, let the cold air in, and just listened. No footsteps, no arguments, no trespassers. Just whined against the lake. I poured a glass of whiskey, raised it to the dark water, and said quietly, lesson learned on both sides. But fate, like paperwork, rarely closes neatly. In early spring, I got a certified letter from the county tax office. Not a warning, an update. Emma and Mark had moved out of state, yes, but they'd registered a business under their new address, Henson Hale Home Design, LLC. The audacity almost made me laugh. Using my name to sell house plans online. It was petty, small, and doomed to fail, but it still had my name attached. James called the next morning. Already handled, he said. Trademark claim filed. Within 2 weeks, they'll get the takedown notice, and they did. By the end of the month, their website disappeared. I thought that would be the last echo, but about a month later, I got an unexpected visit. Mark. He looked thinner, tired, older. He didn't say much at first, just stood on the porch, hands in his pockets. Dad, he said finally. I didn't know about the business thing. Emma did it without asking. I studied his face. He was telling the truth, or at least trying to. You chose her side, I said quietly. Every step of the way. I thought I was helping, he said. I thought if I kept the peace, it would all calm down. You can't calm storms by ignoring them, I said. You just drown slower. He looked down, nodding. She left, he said finally. Took her parents and left. No note, no goodbye. For the first time in months, I felt something soften. Where are you staying, I asked. Rented a room downtown, he said. Trying to rebuild. I hesitated, then said, you can stay here temporarily. One condition. You sign the same lease agreement your in-laws refused. He smiled weakly. You're still teaching lessons. Someone has to, I said. That night, Mark slept in the guest suite, the same room his in-laws had claimed. I stood by the hallway door before turning off the lights, realizing the house had come full circle. It had started as a project, become a battlefield, and now it was something else entirely. A classroom built from boundaries. The lesson had cost me peace, family, and time, but it had restored something rarer, self-respect. By the time spring bloomed again, the house felt alive in a new way. I wasn't lonely anymore. I was present. Every wall, every nail, every window was mine, earned, protected, and finally quiet. Mark stayed for the next few weeks, and the first mornings felt heavy with unspoken things. He tried to help, fixed the gutter, mowed the lawn, stacked firewood, but we both knew none of it was about chores. It was about showing presence again. Sometimes I'd catch him standing in the kitchen, staring at the cabinets like he was remembering how the place used to feel before everything collapsed. One evening he said quietly, "It's strange being here without her." I poured him a cup of coffee instead of answering. That was how men in my family handled grief, by keeping the hands busy until words caught up. We fell into a rhythm. I'd make breakfast. He'd check the mail. Some mornings we'd talk about work, or his attempts to pick up freelance design projects online. Once he admitted he'd nearly signed a contract using the Henson Hale name again because it sounded trustworthy. I didn't scold him. I just said, "Your own name is enough." It always was. About a month later, the county clerk sent a notice of court closure for the harassment case. All claims resolved, no violations reported. James called that afternoon. "Congratulations," he said. "Your record's clean permanently." I told him to send me the original file for safekeeping. When it arrived, I placed it in the same drawer as the deed. There was something poetic about the 3 folders sitting side by side: house, harassment, and ownership. The trilogy of survival in modern times. Life began to find its small joys again. On Sundays, I cooked breakfast for both of us. Real breakfast with bacon, eggs, and orange juice squeezed by hand. Mark started talking more freely then, usually about the past. "I kept thinking you were overreacting," he said once. "Emma said you hated her family because they weren't like Mom." "It was never about class," I said. "It was about responsibility. Mom and I worked for what we had. They just borrowed." He nodded slowly like a man hearing a language he'd once known but forgotten. Then one evening near dusk, a black sedan stopped in front of the driveway. Mark looked up from his laptop. Expecting anyone? I shook my head. Two men stepped out, both in plain clothes, badges clipped to their belts. One of them called out, "Mr. Hale?" I nodded, walked to the porch. "We're from the State Tax Bureau," the taller one said. "Routine verification regarding a property valuation discrepancy." My first thought, not again. I led them inside. They asked a few questions about purchase dates, contractor invoices, and occupancy. 10 minutes later, it was clear this wasn't random. Someone had submitted a tip claiming the house's declared value was fraudulently low. It was Emma's handwriting again, the same loops on the letters, the same exaggerated slant. I smiled, almost pitying her persistence. The agents left satisfied, but I knew what I had to do next. That night, I called James again. "They're trying to trigger an audit," I said. "She's running out of moves," he replied. "Let's finish this properly." He drafted one last document, a cease contact petition merged with a civil protection order. It was a simple, final line of defense. Any further attempt to involve me or my property in false claims would automatically escalate to criminal harassment. We filed it the next morning. By evening, I had a confirmation email from the court. Petition accepted and recorded. After that, everything stopped. No letters, no calls, no cars parked across the street. The silence that followed was deep, like the air after thunder. I didn't realize how tense I'd been until it all disappeared. In early summer, I started rebuilding the dock completely, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to leave something new behind. Mark helped, hammering boards beside me in the heat. At one point, he looked up and said, "You know, I finally get it. You weren't protecting the house. You were protecting your peace." I looked at him and said, "Same thing." When the dock was finished, he sat down on the edge, shoes off, feet in the water. "You think I'll ever be like you?" he asked. "I hope not," I said, smiling. "I want you to be smarter. Learn without breaking what you're trying to build." We stayed there until the sun dipped below the trees, the air thick with the smell of pine and lake water. Weeks later, Mark got a call from a contractor out of state offering him a steady job, project designer for small homes. "It's not glamorous," he said, "but it's honest." I told him that's exactly what makes it worth doing. When he packed his things, I slipped an envelope into his bag. Inside was a check, not a gift, but a seed money loan agreement, written the same way I'd write any business deal. At the bottom it said, "Repay when you're ready." No interest, just integrity. After he left, the house was quiet again, but not empty this time. The silence felt earned, like something I'd fought for and won. I kept volunteering, started hosting small repair workshops for retirees, teaching them how to build birdhouses, fix old fences, patch drywall. It sounds simple, but there's a strange kind of healing in putting broken things back together. Every now and then, a letter from Mark would arrive, short updates, sketches of designs he'd made. Sometimes a photo of a finished house. "Built it right this time," he'd write. Each one felt like a page from a book I thought had ended but didn't. Then, one evening in September, a thick white envelope arrived addressed to me in handwriting I hadn't seen in months. No return address. Inside was a short letter in Emma's handwriting. "You were right. I pushed too far. My parents are gone, moved in with my sister. Mark told me you gave him another chance. I'm not asking for anything. Just wanted to say I finally understand what you meant by ownership. It's not just about property. It's about self-control. I hope you're well." There was no signature, no address, no request for forgiveness, just that. I stood there holding the letter for a long time before placing it in the drawer beside the deed and the old wedding ring. That night, I walked down to the dock again. The water was still, the sky wide open. I looked back at the house, its lights glowing warm through the glass, and realized I had spent so long defending it that I'd forgotten it was meant to be lived in. For the first time, I didn't feel like a guard. I felt like an owner, not of walls or land, but of peace. Autumn came quietly that year, the kind that paints everything gold before winter strips it bare. I started waking up later, letting the sun find me instead of chasing it. The morning smelled of damp pine and brewed coffee. The lake steamed like breath. For the first time in years, there was no tension in the air, just the rhythm of a place finally undisturbed. Sometimes I'd catch myself expecting a knock at the door, a letter, a new claim, but none came. That's the strange thing about peace. It takes longer to trust than war. You wait for the sound that never comes and only then realize you've healed. Mark called every Sunday now. He sounded different and steadier, anchored. He'd found a small apartment near his new work site, was designing lake cabins for a local builder. They're nothing fancy, he said, but they're clean. People like them because they're simple. I laughed. Simplicity is the hardest thing to build. He chuckled. Guess I learned from the best. His voice didn't carry guilt anymore, just clarity. It's strange how time redeems people when pride stops leading them. He'd started paying back the loan, too. Small amounts mailed monthly, with handwritten notes like for lesson number 3 or interest in wisdom. I kept everyone. In late October, a letter arrived from James. Not legal papers this time, but a card. Inside he'd written, retiring next month. Thank you for being my most disciplined client, and my quietest victory story. I smiled reading it. People like him don't say friend, but they mean it. I decided to drive into town and visit him before he closed his practice. We met at a cafe near the courthouse, the same one where I'd signed half the documents that had defined this last chapter of my life. He looked older, softer. You taught me something, you know, he said over black coffee. Most people want revenge. You wanted order? That's rarer. I told him I'd had enough chaos to last me a lifetime. You ever miss it? He asked. The fight? I thought for a moment. No, the silence after it. Every day. He nodded like a man who understood exactly what I meant. Driving home, I took the long route around the lake. The road curved through birch and oak, leaves scattered like confetti from a season ending gracefully. I realized it had been nearly a year since Emma's parents had last tried anything. Maybe they'd finally found another couch to claim, another house to haunt. I didn't wish them ill. I just wished them far away. That night I decided to go through the safe, something I hadn't done in months. The ring was still there, the deed, the court filings. But next to them now sat Mark's repayment envelopes stacked neatly. One by one, I read his little notes until I reached the latest one paid in full. But the real debt was mine. Thanks for not closing the door forever. I held that one longer than the rest. Maybe forgiveness doesn't need a grand gesture, just quiet persistence. The following week, I started clearing the guest room again, not out of need, but as preparation for whatever might come next. I opened the windows, let the cold air in, and realized the house smelled new again. It didn't smell of intrusion or fear, just wood and air and the faint trace of soap. I thought about inviting Mark for Thanksgiving. Maybe we'd eat on the deck like before everything went wrong. Maybe this time there'd be laughter instead of tension. But the world rarely lets you keep peace unchallenged. A few days before Thanksgiving, a man in a gray suit arrived unannounced. Mr. Hale, he said, showing a badge from a debt recovery agency. We're conducting a follow-up inquiry related to Emma Henson. My stomach tightened. She doesn't live here, I said. Hasn't for a long time. He nodded. We know. But she listed this address as a guarantor location for a personal loan. We're required to verify. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Guarantor? I didn't co-sign a thing. He smiled apologetically. We can see that. Don't worry, your record's clean. We just needed a signature confirming non-association. I signed it right there on the porch, and as he left, I asked, how much was the loan? He glanced at his clipboard. $22,000 unsecured. I watched his car disappear down the road, feeling that old mix of disappointment and relief. Some people never stop testing gravity until it breaks them. That evening, I drafted a short email to James's replacement at the law office, a younger associate named Cole. I attached the incident report and wrote, please add this to the record under file 47H. 10 minutes later, he replied, got it? Don't worry, Mr. Hale, you're protected. Those 2 words, you're protected, carried more comfort than I expected. Thanksgiving came quiet, but warm. Mark drove up early that morning, bringing 2 pies and an old bottle of bourbon. We cooked together for the first time since his wedding day. Just simple food, turkey, roasted vegetables, nothing fancy. We ate on the deck, watching the sun fade behind the trees. At one point, he raised his glass and said, to lessons learned the hard way. I added, and to homes that stayed ours. We laughed. And for a brief moment, it felt like we'd reclaimed not just the house, but the past. After dinner, Mark pulled out an envelope. I found this in one of Mom's old boxes, he said. Inside was a handwritten note from my late wife dated 15 years ago. It read, "When this house is built, make sure it stays filled with honesty, even if that means it's empty sometimes." My throat tightened reading it. She'd seen the future more clearly than I had. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my pocket. "She was always smarter than me," I said. Mark smiled. "Yeah, but she picked you, so maybe not by much." Winter arrived early. Snow dusted the lake, turning everything silver. I started keeping a small lamp burning in the window at night, not out of fear anymore, but as a symbol. A quiet signal that the house was alive, not haunted by old noise. Some nights I'd hear the distant sound of wind moving through the pines and imagine it carrying away every echo that had ever tried to settle here. I never heard from Emma again. Not another letter, not a rumor. Maybe she'd finally learned the same thing I had, that taking what isn't yours only leaves you emptier. By December, Mark's business had grown enough that he invited me to visit his new project, a lakeside development 2 counties over. The homes were modest but beautiful, built with precision and care. Standing there watching him instruct the crew, clipboard in hand, I saw something familiar in his posture. Calm authority, no wasted words. For the first time, I realized the lesson hadn't just been about the house. It had been about legacy, the quiet kind, built through example. When I drove back home that night, the road glowed under a thin layer of frost. The house waited for me, warm light spilling from the windows. I parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a moment, listening to the hum of the heater inside. Everything I'd fought for, every paper signed, every word unsaid, and it all led to this: peace earned, not given. And I finally understood what my wife's letter really meant. Keeping a house honest isn't about who lives in it. It's about who refuses to let corruption take root in its walls. By January, the lake froze solid, and the world turned quiet enough that I could hear the trees shift under the weight of snow. Every morning, I'd walk down to the dock with a mug of coffee steaming in my hands and watch the ice harden, a sheet of glass stretching from shore to horizon. Sometimes I thought of everything that had happened, all the noise, the accusations, the manipulation, and it felt almost unreal now, like a story that had belonged to someone else. But then I'd catch a glimpse of the deed framed above my desk, or the faint scratch on the kitchen counter left by Emma's mother's wine glass, and I'd remember that peace is never permanent. It's something you defend, quietly, every day. Mark called often that winter. His new company was taking off, one small project at a time. "We're booked until June," he said once, pride in his voice. "Guess people like straightforward builders." "People always do," I said. "They just forget until they get burned." We spoke less about the past now and more about the future, about new materials, sustainable wood, efficient layouts. Once he asked, "You ever think of selling the house?" I laughed. "And give up my fortress?" "No," he said, smiling through the phone. "I meant to build another one. Together this time. Different lake. New foundation." The idea hung there between us, not as a dream but as a possibility. "Maybe one day," I said, "when this one has taught me everything it can." But even peace has ripples. Around February, I got a letter forwarded from the county office, a formal notice of estate review. Emma's parents had both passed away within a few weeks of each other. No assets, no will, only debt. The clerk was reaching out to verify potential familial claim. I read it twice and felt nothing at first, just stillness. Then a slow, cold sadness, the kind that isn't about grief but about waste, so much chaos for nothing lasting. I wrote back, "No relation, no claim, no objection." That was the end of their story and mine. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of how circles close, how the ones who took so much end up leaving less than zero. I told Mark when he visited next. He just nodded. "I don't hate them anymore," he said. "I just don't think about them." That was progress, the kind that doesn't make headlines but saves souls. Spring returned early that year, as if the world was eager to turn the page. The ice cracked open in April with a deep groan, the water beneath alive again. I decided to rebuild the dock one more time. Not because it needed it, but because every board replaced felt like a renewal. Mark came up on weekends, sometimes with one of his young workers. Kids barely in their 20s, all eager hands and nervous laughter. They'd call me sir until I told them to stop. Just call me Hale, I'd say. Titles belong to offices, not workshops. Watching them build reminded me of who I'd been before the fights, before the lawyers, before the boundaries had to be weaponized. One Saturday, while we were fitting the last railing, Mark asked, "Do you ever regret not fighting differently?" I tightened the bolt, took a breath. "No," I said. "You can't argue with people who twist kindness into opportunity. You just have to close the door, politely, permanently." He nodded. "Emma used to say you were ruthless." I smiled faintly. She mistook precision for cruelty. They all did. We finished the dock by sunset. The water glowed orange and silver, the reflection of the house steady and whole. We sat on the edge, feet dangling over the lake, and for a long time neither of us spoke. The only sound was the wind and a distant loon calling across the water. Finally, Mark said, "You know, I used to think revenge was loud, that it had to be shouting and slammed doors." I glanced at him. "And now?" "Now I think it's just order, doing things right when everyone else plays dirty." I nodded. "That's the kind that lasts." Over the next months, I started getting calls from neighbors, not about trouble, but about advice. Fixing a roof, dealing with property disputes, negotiating contracts. One woman said, "You're like the local lawyer without the fees." I laughed. Just a man who learned the hard way. People began stopping by more often, and the house, once a fortress, became something gentler, a kind of quiet courthouse of reason. I never turned anyone away, but I always made one rule clear: put everything in writing. It was my mantra now, both literal and philosophical. One evening, after a long day of helping an older couple settle a boundary line dispute, I found myself sitting on the porch with an old journal I hadn't opened in years, my wife's. On the last page, written in her looping handwriting, was a line I'd forgotten. "You build homes the way you live, measured, strong, but open where the light belongs." I sat there for a long time with those words in my head, realizing she'd predicted even this, that one day I'd stop defending and start teaching again. Then, one late summer night, Mark drove up with a surprise. "Come outside," he said, grinning like a boy. In the driveway stood a pickup truck loaded with lumber and plans rolled up in a tube. "Phase 2, he said. "Small cabin on the other side of the lake. For you. I already bought the plot. Figured it's time we build something together again." I didn't answer at first. I just looked at him, at the steadiness in his eyes, the quiet pride. Then I said, "We'll do it, but on one condition: you design it. And this time we put both our names on the deed." He smiled. "Deal." That fall, construction began, slow, careful, deliberate. Every nail driven felt like rewriting history in better ink. We'd work for hours, barely speaking, just the sound of hammers and wind. When it was done, the cabin stood facing west, perfectly aligned with the sunset. On the last evening before winter, we sat inside by the new fireplace, the air thick with sawdust and warmth. Mark looked at the flames and said quietly, "I used to think your lesson was about control, but it was about respect, wasn't it?" I nodded. "Respect and record-keeping, two things that outlive us." He laughed, and the sound filled the room like light. When I drove back to my main house that night, the road shimmered under frost, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was carrying it forward. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. I stood in the doorway, took one last look around, and whispered, "Lesson complete," but even as I said it, I knew lessons never really end. They just pass down like tools, from one steady hand to another. The snow came early that year, thick and quiet, burying the lake under a sheet of white glass. The air smelled of cedar and smoke, and every sound, wind, footsteps, the creak of the porch boards, felt sharper in the cold. I woke up before dawn most mornings now, made coffee, and stood by the window watching my two houses breathe steam into the frozen air. The old one, the fortress I'd defended, and across the lake, the cabin Mark and I had built together. They looked like two parts of the same sentence, one written in warning, the other in peace. Sometimes I'd drive around just to stand on the opposite shore and see the lights reflect off the ice. It reminded me that everything solid in life, respect, truth, decency, starts as something fragile you protect long enough to harden. By January, Mark had officially registered our cabin under Hale & Son Design. He sent me a photo of the certificate with a short message. "First project. First clean name." I saved that picture on my phone, the way some people save family portraits. He came up every weekend after that, sometimes with blueprints, sometimes just with stories about clients and lumber prices. We talked less about the past now. I think we'd said everything there was to say. But every time he left, he'd hug me before getting in his truck. He'd never done that before. It was awkward, then natural, then routine. That small ritual said what words couldn't. That forgiveness had finished its long, quiet work. The house had changed too. The walls no longer felt like armor but like shelter again. I hung my wife's sketches in the hallway, the ones she'd made when the house was just a dream, and planted a small birch by the dock where she used to stand. When the wind came through the leaves, it made a soft whispering sound, almost like her voice. Some nights I'd sit on the steps with a glass of whiskey and talk to the air, tell her how stubborn our son had been, how smart he'd become, how peace finally cost less than pride. One evening, I found myself opening the old safe again. Inside lay the same three things: her ring, the deed, and the court folder. But beside them now were new items: Mark's final repayment note, our cabin's deed, and a photo of us standing side by side in front of the new build, both smiling, both grounded. The balance was complete: loss on one side, restoration on the other. I closed the safe gently, knowing I might never need to open it again. By spring, the ice melted early and the lake came alive with sound. The dock creaked, the geese returned, the trees shook off their frost. I started teaching again at the workshop in town. This time not just repairs, but patience. You don't measure wood to control it, I'd tell them. You measure to respect it. And maybe that was the truest lesson of all, the one life had hammered into me through every conflict, every document, every quiet night. Control is temporary, respect is permanent. Sometimes new couples move into houses nearby, young and full of ideas. They stop by to ask for advice about fences or contracts or foundations. I always tell them the same thing: keep your receipts. And your dignity. They laugh, not realizing those two things are harder to rebuild than any wall. Now when I sit by the lake at sunset, I watch the reflection of both homes flicker across the water, the old one solid, the new one still growing. They don't compete. They coexist, like the man I was and the man I became. I've learned that revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just signs its name, builds again, and sleeps well at night. So maybe that's the real ending. Not the moment you win, but the moment you stop needing to. Tell me, what would you have done if it were your house, your family, your line in the sand? And where are you watching from tonight? What corner of the world are you calling home?